Welcome to our deep dive into Scrum. We've got a whole bunch of resources here to really help us understand this agile framework.
We got diagrams. We've even got a little history in here.
Even some stuff about technical debt.
Oh, yeah, it can get scary in there.
It can get real messy real fast.
To really get it, though,
Mm.
I think it helps to go way back to the beginning, back to the roots.
Okay, back to the roots.
We're talking about a 1986 Harvard Business Review article
Wow.
that used a rugby analogy.
Rugby.
Yeah, for product development. It's interesting how scrumming on the field can actually inspire a whole management philosophy.
It's come a long way. And one thing that's clear from all this material is that Scrum is definitely not one size fits all.
Right. It's not a magic bullet or anything.
But the Sinafin framework kind of helps us understand why.
Yeah, the Sinafin framework, it's basically a way to think about different kinds of problems.
Okay.
Like simple problems. They have really clear solutions. Complicated problems. They need more expertise to figure out. But then you've got complex problems. Think like developing a brand new software product.
Oh, yeah, lots of unknowns there.
Tons of unknowns. And that's where Scrum really shines because
Yeah.
you're constantly navigating those unknowns. You're
We're
adapting.
really constantly adapting.
Exactly. Traditional methods, those waterfall methods with their
Yeah.
rigid plans, they just fall apart under that kind of pressure.
They can't handle the chaos.
Uh-huh.
So Scrum is all about embracing the chaos, expecting change. But how does a team actually do that?
It all boils down to three things. Inspection, adaptation, and transparency. They're super important.
Okay, I'm listening.
Think of it as a constant feedback loop.
Okay.
Teams check in on their progress really often. Then they adjust their approach based on what they've learned.
Makes sense.
And they make sure everybody's on the same page all the time.
Which brings us to another key idea, validated learning.
Ah, yes. It's not about just making assumptions and crossing your fingers.
Right. You have to test those assumptions.
It's about running all sorts of little experiments, all at the same time getting feedback quickly, and then taking what you learned and putting it into the next iteration.
So it's kind of like an Olympic relay race where all the runners are on the track simultaneously,
I like that analogy.
learning from each other and changing their strategy on the fly.
Yeah. It's pretty cool how that works.
Now, even though speed and flexibility are super important,
No.
our sources also really highlight the importance of minimizing waste.
Oh, absolutely.
And I don't just mean like wasted resources.
No. It's more about making sure everyone's time and energy are being used effectively,
So it's like telling those Olympic runners to stay busy 100% of the time.
even when they don't have the baton.
Exactly. They'd be exhausted and it wouldn't actually help them win the race.
Right. It's about focusing on the right work at the right time, making sure everybody's efforts are moving the team towards that big goal.
So we've talked about the framework and the mindset,
Uh,
but who are the players in the Scrum game?
well, we hear a lot about the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the development team.
But these aren't your typical project manager, developer, tester roles, are they?
No, not at all. One source actually used the phrase musketeer attitude.
All for one and one for all.
That's it. The team succeeds or fails together. It's all about shared accountability.
So let's break down these roles a bit, starting with the product owner. It sounds like they're the voice of the customer, the champion of the product's vision.
Yeah, they are. They pretty much live and breathe the product backlog.
Oh, but the product backlog, what is that exactly?
You can think of it as the prioritized wish list of everything the product needs.
So the product owner is the one who figures out what to build next.
Right. And they also refine those items on the backlog, and they're constantly communicating with stakeholders and the development team.
So they bridge the gap between what the market wants and what the team can actually create.
They wear a lot of hats.
They do. And then there's the Scrum Master. This is a role that a lot of people find confusing.
It is. It's definitely not your traditional manager role.
So what is it then?
I'd say they're more like a coach, a facilitator, someone who helps the team work well together.
So removing roadblocks, keeping things moving.
Exactly. Think of them as a leader who empowers, not a manager who dictates.
That makes a lot of sense considering how much Scrum emphasizes teamwork and autonomy.
Right. It's all about giving people the freedom to do their best work.
So it seems like clear communication between all these roles is absolutely essential.
Oh, absolutely. Communication is Scrum's lifeblood. You can't have a high-performing team without it.
Everybody needs to be on the same page working towards that shared goal.
And this transparency, it actually extends beyond the team. It's about making sure the stakeholders can see what's going on, too.
So everyone's in the loop.
Everyone. Okay, so we've got the values, we've got the roles. Now let's get into the actual practices that make Scrum tick.
It all seems to start with the product backlog, right?
Right, but think of it as a living document. It's constantly evolving.
Okay, so it's not just a static list.
No, it's more like a prioritized queue of product backlog items, or PBIs. PBIs, exactly. These could be anything from big features to tiny bug fixes. And they're always being refined as the team learns new things.
So each sprint starts with the team grabbing a chunk of those PBIs during sprint planning.
That's right.
And then they commit to a sprint goal and figure out what they can actually achieve within that time box.
Yeah, it's all about setting a sustainable pace, not burning the team out.
So you really need a well-groomed backlog to make sprint planning work.
Oh, absolutely. If those PBIs are unclear or you don't have any estimates, it's going to be a rough sprint.
It's not just picking tasks. It's
Yeah.
about setting the stage for success.
Right.
And then we move into sprint execution, the daily grind.
The fun part.
The sources talk about daily Scrum meetings to keep everyone aligned,
Those are key.
and they emphasize the importance of workflow management.
Ah, yes. It's about finding the right balance between parallel work and swarming.
Swarming.
Swarming. It's when the whole team focuses on one complex task together to get it done super fast.
Oh, I see.
It's like a concentrated burst of teamwork.
And while they're building, testing, integrating all that good stuff, strong technical practices are key.
Oh, definitely. We're talking automated testing refactoring. Keeping the code clean and easy to work with.
These aren't just buzzwords, are they?
Nope, they're essential. They help maintain quality and manage that technical debt monster.
Because without them, all those iterations can create a real mess.
A tangled web of code.
Yeah. So the sprint ends.
And it's showtime.
It's time for the sprint review.
Yeah? It's a chance to show off what the team's accomplished.
But it's also a feedback session with stakeholders, especially with real users,
That's the most important part.
because you want to make sure you're building the right thing.
Absolutely.
And finally, we have the sprint retrospective.
Ah, yes, a time for reflection.
The team takes a step back, thinks about their process, and figures out how to improve for the next sprint.
Imagine the team sitting down and asking themselves, what went well? What didn't go so well? What can we do differently next time?
It's all about continuous improvement.
At its core, that's what Scrum is all about.
So we've covered a lot of ground, but we've really only just dipped our toes into the Scrum pool.
There's a lot more to explore.
Up next, we'll tackle some meatier topics, like technical debt and velocity.
Stay tuned.
Okay, so let's dive into some of those deeper waters, shall we?
Let's do it.
Technical debt, it's something you hear about all the time in software development.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Our sources actually break it down into 3 different types.
Right.
3: naive, unavoidable, and strategic.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Naive debt, that's often the result of inexperience,
Right. Or rushing to meet deadlines without really thinking about the long-term consequences.
Exactly. It's like building a house on a foundation of sand.
Yeah, it's not going to end well.
Unavoidable debt, though, that's different.
That's more like getting hit by a sudden storm. Sometimes things just happen that you couldn't have planned for.
You can't predict everything.
Nope.
But strategic debt, now that's where things get interesting.
That's the calculated risk.
Yeah, it's like a startup that's racing to release a feature before their competitor does,
They might take on some technical debt intentionally just to speed up development.
knowing that they'll have to clean things up later on.
It's a trade-off.
Yeah.
Short-term gain for potential long-term pain.
And our sources are really clear about one thing. Ignoring technical debt will come back to bite you.
Oh, yeah. It'll catch up with you eventually.
But it's not about stopping everything and fixing all the problems at once, right?
It's more about making regular payments.
Like managing your personal finances.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You wouldn't ignore a credit card with a high interest rate, would you?
No way.
You'd make those payments consistently to chip away at it.
Makes sense.
It's the same idea with technical debt. You refactor your code, you clean it up, you make it easier to work with. And that's like lowering the interest rate on that debt.
You're stopping it from getting out of control.
Exactly.
Now, speaking of managing work, our sources also talk about velocity.
Velocity, a classic Scrum metric.
It's a big one. But they warn against using it as just a simple measure of team performance.
Yeah, it's not just about how fast a team can crank out code.
So what is it really about then?
Well, velocity is a way to estimate how much work a team can realistically complete in a sprint.
So it's kind of like knowing your car's average fuel efficiency.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
It helps you plan your journey.
Exactly. You know how far you can go on a tank of gas?
But velocity isn't a fixed number.
Yeah.
It changes. It fluctuates.
Based on all sorts of factors.
Right. Like changes to the team, new technologies, unexpected challenges. All sorts of stuff.
And one source even goes so far as to debunk the myth of constantly increasing velocity.
Ah, yes. The pressure to always be getting faster.
It's not about pushing the team to work harder and faster every single sprint.
No, it's about finding that sweet spot, that sustainable pace.
Right, because if you're training for a marathon, you wouldn't try to increase your speed every single day.
You need rest. You need recovery. You need time to adapt.
It's the same with software development.
If you push for unrealistic velocity increases, you end up with burnout. You end up with lower quality code. You end up with a team that's less effective overall.
So how do we balance this need for sustainable velocity with the reality of technical debt and changing priorities and the constant pressure to deliver value quickly?
It's a balancing act, for sure.
It is.
It's about making smart decisions, understanding the trade-offs, and always being ready to adapt.
Our sources highlight the benefits of smaller, more frequent releases.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
It's not just about getting feedback faster.
Right. It's also about reducing risk.
And improving the overall economics of software development.
Exactly. One source actually uses the analogy of a giant truck convoy trying to navigate a winding road.
Oh, wow. That's a visual.
It is. It's slow. It's inflexible. And if one truck breaks down, the whole convoy grinds to a halt.
Ouch.
Smaller, more frequent releases are like those nimble little cars. They can zip around corners, avoid obstacles, and get to their destination much faster.
They're more adaptable.
Way more adaptable.
And they avoid that convoy effect.
Exactly.
They allow for more flexibility and responsiveness to change.
Now, speaking of adapting, our sources emphasize that Scrum itself is adaptable.
It is. It's a framework, not a rigid set of rules.
So you can tailor Scrum to fit different situations, different projects.
Absolutely. For example, there's this technique called sprint mapping.
Sprint mapping.
Yeah, it's a way to visualize dependencies and plan work across multiple sprints.
Sounds useful.
It is, especially when you have several teams working together on a big, complex project.
So it's all about finding what works best for your specific needs.
Right. And when it comes to releases, there's also a lot of flexibility. You can choose fixed date releases.
Where you adjust the scope to meet a deadline.
Exactly. Or you can go with fixed scope releases.
Where you adjust the timeline to deliver a set of features.
That's right. It all comes down to understanding your goals, your constraints, and picking the approach that makes the most sense.
So we've talked about technical debt. We've talked about velocity. We've talked about the flexible nature of Scrum. But what about those early stages of a project? The beginning.
The beginning. You know, that crucial envisioning phase where you're figuring out what to build and why? A lot of people think envisioning means, spending weeks or even months creating these really detailed plans and specifications up front.
Yeah, they think it's all about getting everything perfect before you even start building.
Right. But our sources suggest a totally different approach.
They call it economically sensible envisioning.
Okay, economically sensible envisioning.
Yeah, it's about gathering just enough information to figure out if a project is actually worth pursuing.
So you're not getting bogged down in all those tiny details too early.
Exactly.
So instead of mapping out every single feature and user story, you might start with a rough outline.
Yeah, just focusing on the big picture and the main goals.
One source even suggested using t-shirt sizing to estimate effort at this stage.
Small, medium, large.
Exactly, instead of getting lost in all those precise numbers.
Right. It's just about getting a general sense of the scope and the complexity.
Before you really dive in.
Before you start sprinting.
Okay, that makes sense. But even with a solid vision, things change, right? Priorities shift.
Happens all the time.
So how does Scrum handle that kind of constant evolution?
That's where validated learning comes in.
Ah, yes. Validated learning again.
You're always testing your assumptions, you're gathering feedback, you're adjusting course as you go.
So it's not just about the product, it's about the process, too.
And even the vision itself.
You're constantly iterating.
Constantly. Now, our sources also touch on something that's often overlooked. Portfolio planning.
Portfolio planning.
Yeah, it's about zooming out and looking at the big picture. What products are we going to build? Which ones do we prioritize? How do we manage resources across different teams?
So it's all about maximizing value at the organizational level?
Exactly.
Okay.
One source talks about creating a portfolio backlog.
A portfolio backlog.
It's like a prioritized list of all the big things the company wants to do. Products, programs, major initiatives, things that align with the company's overall strategy.
So you're making sure you're working on the right things.
The things that matter most. And they also emphasize the importance of marginal economics.
Marginal economics.
It's basically asking yourself, what's going to give us the biggest bang for our buck?
So you're not just chasing every shiny new idea that comes along.
Nope. You're being strategic.
Yeah.
You're thinking about the bottom line. And that kind of economic thinking,
Yeah.
it needs to be everywhere in the organization, not just in the development teams.
Right. Everyone needs to be on the same page.
Exactly. Which brings us to the role of managers in a Scrum environment.
Yeah, their job sounds pretty different from the traditional command and control style of management.
One source describes managers as servant leaders.
Servant leaders.
Yeah, they're focused on supporting the teams, removing obstacles, creating an environment where everyone can do their best work.
So it's less about telling people what to do and more about helping them succeed.
Exactly. It's about fostering collaboration,
Yeah.
trust, a shared sense of ownership, creating a culture where people feel empowered.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've explored the core principles of Scrum, we've delved into the practices, we've even talked about the bigger organizational picture.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. But the real takeaway here is that Scrum is more than just a set of rules or a bunch of rituals.
Right. It's a way of thinking.
It's a mindset that embraces change, prioritizes value, empowers teams to do amazing work.
And this deep dive, it's really just the beginning.
It's just a taste.
I encourage everyone to keep exploring, keep learning, and see how these ideas can transform your own work.
Absolutely. And here's a final thought to chew on. If you were leading a Scrum team, how would you balance that need for speed with the reality of technical debt?
That's a good one.
How would you make sure your team is delivering both value and equality?
Lots to think about.
Keep those questions in mind as you continue your Scrum journey. Until next time, keep on diving.